The stained glass windows of St. Jude's Cathedral offered no comfort to Caroline. Her groom was 40 minutes late, the whispers of 400 guests echoing like shattered glass. She was about to announce her own humiliation until the heavy oak doors crashed open and 50 armed royal guards marched in. The air inside the bridal suite of St. Jude's Cathedral was thick with the suffocating scent of white lilies and hairspray. Caroline Hayes stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, her reflection framed by layers of imported French lace and a veil that felt heavier by the second. It was 2:15 p.m. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 1:30 p.m. "Try his phone again," Caroline whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Her hands, clutching a bouquet of tightly bound white roses, were pale and completely bloodless. Her maid of honor Beatrice paced the length of the opulent room, her thumbs flying across her glowing smartphone screen. "It's still going straight to voicemail, Care. I've called him 12 times. I've called his brother. I've called the best man. None of them are answering." Caroline closed her eyes, fighting the sharp sting of tears. Outside the heavy mahogany doors, she could hear the low, undeniable hum of 400 restless guests. The congregation wasn't just family and friends. It was a curated exhibition of London's elite. Arthur Montgomery, her fiancé, was the heir to Montgomery Holdings, a billion-pound real estate empire. Caroline, a senior archivist at the National Library, had always felt like an outsider in his world of private jets, polo matches, and ruthless social climbing. Arthur's mother, Victoria Montgomery, had made no secret of her disdain for the match. "You are a sweet girl," Caroline Victoria had purred at the rehearsal dinner, her voice dripping with venom. "But in our world, love is a luxury. Strategic alliances are a necessity. I only hope Arthur knows what he is sacrificing." "Caroline," Beatrice said softly, breaking the silence. She had stopped pacing. Her face was ashen, her eyes locked on her phone. "What is it?" Caroline asked, her stomach dropping into a bottomless abyss. "Did he text you?" Beatrice didn't answer. She slowly walked over and turned the screen toward Caroline. It was a news alert from a prominent British tabloid pushed just 3 minutes ago. "Exclusive: Arthur Montgomery elopes with tech heiress Chloe Dubois in secret Lake Como ceremony." Underneath the blaring headline was a blurry but undeniable paparazzi photograph of Arthur. He was wearing a white tuxedo, the very tuxedo he was supposed to be wearing right now, kissing Chloe Dubois, the daughter of a French telecommunications magnate, on the deck of a vintage Riva speedboat. The bouquet slipped from Caroline's hands, hitting the hardwood floor with a soft, pathetic thud. The world tilted on its axis. He hadn't just gotten cold feet. He had orchestrated a public execution of her dignity. The entire wedding at St. Jude's, the flowers, the choir, the 400 guests, was a decoy. A smokescreen designed to keep the press occupied in London, while he secured the strategic alliance his mother had always demanded. "That absolute monster!" Beatrice breathed, her eyes blazing with fury. "Caroline, we have to get you out of here. We'll go out the back. My car is in the alley." But the shock was rapidly calcifying into something else inside Caroline. For 2 years, she had contorted herself to fit into the Montgomery mold. She had endured Victoria's passive-aggressive insults, the grueling etiquette lessons, the ND as the relentless scrutiny of the press. She had loved Arthur, and he had promised her that he was different from his family. "No," Caroline said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. "Caroline, you can't go out there. The guests are already checking their phones. Victoria is probably sitting in the front row gloating. They set you up." "I know they did," Caroline said, stepping over the fallen bouquet. She reached up and adjusted her veil, her eyes locking onto her own reflection. "But if I run out the back door, I am the pathetic, jilted librarian who wasn't good enough. I will not let Victoria Montgomery have the satisfaction of watching me flee." "What are you going to do?" Beatrice asked, terrified. "I'm going to walk out there, stand at that altar, and look every single one of those cowards in the eye when I dismiss them." Before Beatrice could stop her, Caroline gripped the brass handle of the bridal suite door and pulled it open. The long walk from the suite to the narthex of the cathedral felt like a death march. The organist, desperately trying to fill the silence, was playing a looping, melancholic prelude. As Caroline stepped into the vestibule, the murmurs inside the sanctuary reached a fever pitch. Phones were buzzing. The news had broken inside. Caroline stood at the head of the long, velvet-lined aisle. The cathedral was breathtakingly massive, with vaulted stone ceilings and intricate carvings. At the end of the aisle stood the empty altar. In the front pew, sitting with perfect, rigid posture, was Victoria Montgomery. She wasn't looking at her phone. She was looking right at Caroline, and a small, razor-thin smile played on her lips. She had known all along. She had sat in this church for over an hour, watching the spectacle unfold, savoring the destruction of the woman she deemed unworthy of her son. Caroline took a deep, shuddering breath. She stepped forward, preparing to make the lonely, agonizing walk down the aisle to announce the end of her own wedding. But before her satin heel could touch the floor, a sound shattered the quiet murmur of the cathedral. It wasn't a voice. It was the synchronized, thunderous crack of heavy boots. Outside St. Jude's, the frantic shouts of paparazzi and the wail of sirens suddenly pierced the heavy London air. The massive iron-wrought front doors of the cathedral doors that were traditionally locked during a ceremony were violently thrust open, letting in a blinding shaft of afternoon sunlight. The organist abruptly stopped playing. The murmuring of the 400 guests vanished, replaced by a stunned, absolute silence. Marching through the sunlit threshold were 50 men. They moved in perfect, terrifying unison. They were not police officers. They were the King's Guard, dressed in full ceremonial uniform, crimson tunics, gold braiding and gleaming swords at their hips. Clack, clack, clack. The sound of their boots against the ancient stone floor echoed like cannon fire. They split into two columns, marching swiftly down the center aisle, forming a formidable, impenetrable wall of crimson and steel on either side of the velvet runner. They faced inward, their expressions carved from granite. Victoria Montgomery stood up, her smug composure completely evaporating. "What is the meaning of this?" she hissed, though her voice wavered. "This is a private event." None of the guards acknowledged her. From the vestibule, stepping out of the blinding light and into the cool shadows of the cathedral, a single figure emerged. The guests gasped, a collective sound of sheer disbelief sweeping through the pews. Several older attendees instinctively bowed their heads. It was King William, the reigning monarch of the nation, dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal mourning suit. His silver hair neatly combed his blue eyes, sharp and authoritative. He did not look like a man attending a celebration. He looked like a sovereign stepping onto a battlefield. Caroline froze, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She had never met the king. She was a civilian, a quiet archivist who spent her days cataloging historical letters. Her mind raced desperately, trying to comprehend why the most powerful man in the country had just halted her public humiliation. King William walked slowly up the aisle, ignoring the sea of shocked faces. He completely bypassed the Montgomery family, not even gracing Victoria with a glance. He stopped right in front of Caroline. Up close, the king's face was lined with the weight of decades of rule, but his eyes were incredibly warm. "Miss Hayes," the king said. His voice was deep, resonant, and easily carried across the silent cathedral. "Your Majesty," Caroline whispered, sinking into a deep, trembling curtsy. Her heavy dress pooled around her. "Rise, Caroline," King William commanded, gently reaching out to offer his hand. He helped her up, his grip remarkably strong. I don't understand," Caroline breathed, her voice barely audible. "Why are you here?" The king turned slightly, ensuring his voice would project to the very back of the room, and most importantly, to the front pew where the Montgomery family stood in pale, shivering silence. 40 years ago, the king began, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Before I wore the crown, I was a young lieutenant deployed in a covert operation in the Falklands. My unit was ambushed. I was severely wounded, pinned down in the mud, bleeding out. The rest of my squad retreated, believing I was already dead. The cathedral was so silent you could hear the wax dripping from the altar candles. Only one man came back for me, the king continued. A 22-year-old medic from Essex. He carried me on his back for 6 miles through enemy territory. He took 2 bullets to his shoulder, yet he never dropped me. That man saved my life, and by extension, he saved the crown. I offered him a knighthood, a fortune, a place in my court. He refused it all. He told me he only did his duty and asked only that if his family ever truly needed the crown, I would be there. The king turned his full attention, back to Caroline. Tears were welling in her eyes. That man, the king said softly, was your grandfather, Thomas Hayes. Caroline covered her mouth, a sob escaping her lips. Her grandfather had passed away 5 years ago. He had been a quiet, humble man who ran a local hardware store. He had never spoken a word about the military, let alone saving the monarch. This morning, King William's voice grew dangerously sharp, his eyes cutting toward Victoria Montgomery like a blade. My intelligence officers informed me of a pathetic little scheme designed to publicly humiliate the granddaughter of the bravest man I have ever known. I was told that the Montgomery boy had fled and that you were standing here alone, facing a cathedral of wolves. Victoria Montgomery physically recoiled, her face turning the color of ash. The aristocrats and socialites in the pews shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing they were on the wrong side of history. The Montgomery family's social and financial capital was disintegrating in real time. To be publicly shamed by the king was the ultimate death sentence in their world. Your grandfather carried me when I could not walk, King William said, extending his right arm toward Caroline. Allow me to walk with you when you are forced to stand alone. Caroline stared at the king's offered arm, the crushing weight of the betrayal, the fear, the humiliation. It evaporated, replaced by a surge of unimaginable pride. She wasn't an outsider. She was the legacy of a hero. She slipped her hand through the king's arm. Music, the king barked toward the terrified organist. The organist fumbled for a second before smashing his fingers onto the keys, playing a triumphant, soaring rendition of Clark's Trumpet Voluntary. Shall we, Miss Hayes? The king asked. We shall, Your Majesty. Caroline smiled, her tears finally falling, but not from sorrow. With 50 royal guards saluting with drawn swords, Caroline Hayes and King William began their march down the aisle. It was no longer a walk of shame. It was a procession of absolute power. As they passed the first pew, the king paused for a fraction of a second. He looked down at Victoria Montgomery, who was trembling violently. Enjoy your son's new merger, Victoria, the king said quietly, his tone colder than ice. Because as of tomorrow, Montgomery Holdings will never secure another government contract in this kingdom. He didn't wait for her response. He simply continued walking, guiding Caroline toward the altar where her new life was about to begin. The heavy oak doors of St. Jude's Cathedral closed firmly behind Caroline and King William, sealing the Montgomery family inside with their magnificent, utterly worthless floral arrangements and the suffocating silence of their ruined reputation. Outside, the world had exploded. The 50 royal guards formed an impeccable, impenetrable corridor of crimson and steel, holding back a tidal wave of frantic paparazzi. The flashing cameras strobed like lightning across the cathedral steps, capturing the defining image of the decade, a jilted librarian, radiant and unbothered, walking arm in arm with the sovereign of the nation. Within exactly 12 minutes, the photograph was plastered across every digital news outlet and social media platform on the globe. The initial narrative of the runaway billionaire Groom was instantaneously obliterated by the royal intervention. The internet did not merely react, it erupted. The story of Thomas Hayes, the humble medic from Essex who carried a bleeding royal through the mud of the Falklands, was leaked to the press by the king's own communications office. Caroline was no longer the tragic victim of a high society snub. She was the rightful heir to a legacy of unparalleled national heroism, elevated by the crown itself. Inside the cathedral, Victoria Montgomery remained frozen in the front pew. Her manicured hands trembled so violently that her diamond rings clattered against the wooden armrest. The 400 elite guests, politicians, investors, and socialites who had fawned over her just an hour prior, were already treating her like a walking contagion. They filed out in hushed, hurried groups, avoiding her gaze entirely. Nobody offered their sympathies. In the ruthless ecosystem of London's high society, the king's public condemnation was a fatal diagnosis. You did not associate with a family that had incurred the monarch's wrath. 3 hours away, bathed in the golden romantic sunlight of Lake Como, Arthur Montgomery was entirely oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding back home. He sat on the sun-drenched deck of a chartered super yacht, sipping a crisp vintage champagne next to Chloe Dubois. Chloe, draped in designer silk, was busy posting curated snippets of their secret elopement to her millions of followers. Arthur felt a fleeting, superficial twinge of guilt about Caroline, but it was quickly swallowed by the intoxicating thrill of his new reality. He had done what his mother demanded. He had secured the Dubois telecommunications empire, cementing Montgomery Holdings as an untouchable global superpower. Then his phone rang. The caller ID flashed his mother's name. Arthur casually answered, expecting Victoria's usual breathless praise for his strategic brilliance. "Mother, it's done. The ceremony was beautiful, and Chloe's father is already drafting the merger paperwork. Has the press caught on to the diversion at St. Jude's yet?" "You absolute catastrophic fool," Victoria hissed. Her voice was unrecognizable, a raw, guttural rasp of pure, unadulterated panic. "Turn on the television. Look at the news. Look at what you have done." Arthur frowned, signaling for a steward to bring him a tablet. "Mother, calm down. The tabloids are talking about me and Chloe just as we planned." "They are not talking about you," Victoria screamed, the sound cracking horribly over the international line. "They are talking about her. The King Arthur, King William walked Caroline down the aisle. Her grandfather saved his life in the war. The monarch came to the cathedral and he publicly stripped us of our government contracts. The board of directors has already called an emergency meeting. Our investors are pulling out. You need to come back to London immediately. We are ruined." The tablet arrived. Arthur's blood ran cold as he stared at the screen. The headlines were merciless. "The King's Revenge Monarch Rescues War Hero's Granddaughter from Billionaire Coward." Below it was the photograph of Caroline looking breathtakingly regal, flanked by the King's guard. She didn't look broken. She looked victorious. "Arthur," Chloe asked, her perfect pout deepening into a scowl as she noticed his pale, sweat-slicked face. "What's wrong with you? My father is waiting for us to join him for dinner." Arthur dropped the phone. It clattered against the teakwood deck. The champagne in his stomach turned to acid. The empire he had sacrificed, the only woman who ever genuinely loved him to protect, was burning to the ground, and he was the one who had struck the match. By Monday morning, the financial massacre was absolute. The London Stock Exchange opened to a bloodbath for Montgomery Holdings. When the Ministry of Defense and the Department of Infrastructure officially announced the cancellation of all pending contracts with the Montgomery family, citing a re-evaluation of corporate integrity, the stock plummeted by 42% in a single trading session. Victoria Montgomery was forced to resign from 7 charity boards before noon. Meanwhile, Caroline's life had fundamentally transformed. She returned to her modest flat on Sunday evening to find 2 armed royal protection officers stationed discreetly outside her building. On Monday, when she arrived at the National Library, her supervisor informed her that she was no longer a junior archivist. By royal decree, she had been appointed the head curator of the Crown's private historical collection, an incredibly prestigious role that came with an office overlooking the Thames and a salary that rivaled a banking executive's. It was in this new role that Caroline met Lord Harrison Davies. Harrison was the Duke of Pembroke, a renowned historian, and a man who possessed a quiet, grounded intellect that starkly contrasted with Arthur's arrogant superficiality. Harrison had been tasked by the king to assist Caroline in organizing a new national exhibit, honoring the unsung heroes of the armed forces, beginning with the newly declassified records of Thomas Hayes. As they spent weeks poring over ancient manuscripts, war diaries, and faded photographs, Caroline found herself healing faster than she ever thought possible. Harrison didn't treat her like a fragile, jilted bride, nor did he treat her like a royal novelty. He treated her as a brilliant, capable equal. They bonded over their shared love of antiquity, spending late nights in the quiet, dusty vaults of the library, sharing coffee and quiet laughter. For the first time in years, Caroline didn't feel the need to shrink herself to fit into someone else's world. 6 months passed. The chill of the London winter had thawed into a crisp, bright spring, mirroring the complete reversal of fortunes for everyone involved in the disastrous St. Jude's wedding. The highly anticipated Royal Exhibition of Military Valor was set to open at the National Gallery, a glittering black-tie gala hosted by King William himself. Caroline was the guest of honor. As she stood before her mirror preparing for the evening, she didn't see the terrified, insecure woman who had clutched a bouquet of white roses in a bridal suite. She wore a stunning emerald green silk gown that cascaded gracefully to the floor, her hair swept up in an elegant twist. At her throat rested a diamond and emerald pendant, a personal gift from the Queen, quietly delivered that morning. A soft knock at her door broke her reverie. Harrison stood in the hallway, looking dashing in a tailored midnight blue tuxedo. His eyes softened as he took her in, a genuine, breathtaking smile spreading across his face. "You look absolutely extraordinary, Caroline," Harrison murmured, offering his arm. "Are you ready to show the world what you built?" "I am," she replied, her voice steady and full of warmth. She slipped her hand through his arm, feeling a profound sense of safety and belonging that Arthur had never managed to provide. As Caroline's chauffeured Bentley glided toward the National Gallery, the situation in another part of London was drastically, tragically different. Arthur Montgomery was standing on the pavement outside a cheap, rented flat in Mayfair, drenched in the cold spring rain. His designer suits were gone. His private jets were a distant memory. The cruelest twist of fate had not been the loss of the government contracts, but the catastrophic revelation regarding his new bride, Chloe Dubois. 2 months after the wedding, international authorities had raided the Dubois telecommunications headquarters in Paris. The entire empire was a massive, elaborately constructed Ponzi scheme. Chloe's father wasn't a billionaire. He was an international fugitive who had used Arthur's hasty, poorly vetted marriage to siphon what little liquid capital Montgomery Holdings had left to fund his escape to a non-extradition country. Chloe had vanished entirely, leaving Arthur legally tied to a criminal enterprise and drowning in an ocean of debt. Victoria Montgomery had suffered a nervous breakdown and retreated to a crumbling countryside manor, completely alienated from the high society she had worshipped. Arthur was left alone to face the creditors, the lawyers, and the humiliating reality that he had traded his soul for a mirage. Desperation had finally driven him to madness. He needed Caroline. He deluded himself into believing that if he could just speak to her, if he could beg for her forgiveness and leverage her new, immense favor with the crown, she could convince the king to pardon his family. As the Bentley pulled up to the velvet ropes of the National Gallery, the flashbulbs erupted. Caroline and Harrison stepped onto the red carpet, a vision of elegance and power. The crowd cheered, calling out her name. She waved graciously, pausing to speak with the press about the importance of honoring her grandfather's memory. Suddenly, a disturbance broke out near the barricades. A soaked, disheveled figure shoved past a distracted security guard, stumbling wildly onto the edge of the red carpet. "Caroline!" the man shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Caroline, please, I need to talk to you." The royal protection officers reacted instantly, their hands flying to their holsters as they intercepted the intruder. They pinned him swiftly against the metal barricade. Caroline stopped. She turned slowly, her emerald gown catching the harsh glare of the camera lights. She stared at the pathetic, soaking wet man, struggling against the guards. It took her a full 5 seconds to recognize the gaunt, exhausted face of Arthur Montgomery. The press went absolutely dead silent, their cameras poised, waiting for the explosive confrontation. Harrison stepped forward, his jaw clenched, ready to shield Caroline, but she gently placed a hand on his chest, stopping him. "It's all right, Harrison," Caroline said quietly. She walked toward the barricade, stopping just out of Arthur's reach. She looked down at the man who had deliberately planned to humiliate her in front of 400 people. He was shivering, his eyes wide, pleading. "Caroline, please." Arthur begged, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "I made a mistake. I was blind. My mother forced me into it. You have to believe me. They scammed us. Chloe's family took everything. I have nothing left. I love you, Caroline. I always loved you. Please just speak to the king. Tell him we can fix this." Caroline's expression didn't shift. There was no anger left in her, no sorrow, and certainly no pity. She simply looked at him with the cold, absolute detachment of a stranger examining a museum artifact. "You didn't make a mistake, Arthur," Caroline said, her voice carrying clearly over the quiet hum of the astonished crowd. "You made a choice. You chose a spreadsheet over a partnership. You chose your mother's vanity over my dignity. And now you are living with the exact consequences of the life you built." "I am ruined," Arthur sobbed, struggling helplessly against the stone-faced guards. "They took everything. They didn't take anything," Caroline corrected him softly yet firmly. "You handed it to them. Because you were so desperate to be powerful, you forgot how to be a man." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't scream. Her calm indifference was the sharpest blade she could have wielded. It was the ultimate dismissal. "Caroline, please don't leave me like this," he wailed. "I am not leaving you, Arthur," Caroline replied, turning her back on him. "I left you 6 months ago at the altar of St. Jude's. Have a good evening." She walked back to Harrison, who offered her his arm with a look of profound respect and admiration. Together they walked up the grand stone steps and into the brilliant warmth of the gala, leaving Arthur Montgomery sobbing in the rain, surrounded by the merciless flashing of hundreds of cameras, his downfall permanently recorded for the world to see. Inside the gallery, King William was waiting. When he saw Caroline, he smiled, raising his glass in a silent toast to the woman who had not only honored her grandfather's legacy, but had forged an unbreakable, brilliant legacy of her own. If you love this story of ultimate royal revenge and poetic justice, make sure to hit that like button. Caroline's journey from a jilted bride to a celebrated hero's granddaughter proves that karma never misses a target. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that your worth isn't defined by those who betray you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling real-life drama stories, scandalous betrayals, and satisfying twists. See you next time.